I think it can be easily said that the very first Legend of Zelda game is one of the most influential games of all time. This title set such a revolutionary groundwork that action-adventure games even today pay tribute to it in some fashion. As for the game itself, it unfortunately maintains a rather mixed reception nowadays. There are still plenty who swear by this game's quality and believe it holds up just as well today, and others who feel this game has grossly aged. For the longest time, I was in the camp that felt this game had long passed its prime and is best seen as a curiosity for those interested only. The first time I ever played through and completed the game was on the NES Classic Edition. I would hit up Zelda Dungeon and meticulously follow the written guide while abusing the crap out of save states. Sure enough, after some time I would beat the game, but it certainly felt like something I only did just to say, I beat Zelda 1. I didn't really have any strong impressions, nor did my opinion of the game really change. Like many, I would simply hope that a modernized remake of the game could be made to iron out many of the game's flaws. I could see at the time that there was still a great game underneath, but felt various dated aspects held it back. The stiff 4-directional controls, the limited sword combat, the lack of a map, and the cryptic design of secrets having no clues whatsoever. There is a 16-bit remake of sorts via the BS Zelda release on the SNES Satellaview. It was a real-time broadcast title, but has been restructured in a fully playable standalone release. This version is certainly interesting, but not exactly a good substitute to the original experience. The graphics and sound may have gotten a Mario All-Stars-like makeover, but the world design, item collecting, and exploration are quite different. Definitely something for Zelda fans to check out, but for those who want a faithful remake, then this really isn't it. The reason I'm as invested in enjoying this game as much as possible simply stems from Zelda being probably my favorite video game franchise of all time, and I'd rather do what I can to enjoy a game as much as possible rather than writing it off completely. Zelda 1 finds itself in a tricky situation since it has decades of game design evolution to compete with, and it's virtually impossible to really play the game as when it initially launched. Many retro gamers will stand their ground insisting that retro games should be played in a very specific, intended way. I noticed that some of my last video commented how these older retro games should be experienced in the oldest school way possible, with no outside assistance and your own wits and intuition. Certainly a commendable effort should anyone choose to go that route, but the unfortunate reality that I see is that it's not realistically sensible to ask that of a modern gamer. Gamers who were playing Zelda for the first time were kids, probably playing games for the first time. Video games were just entering a new renaissance, so at the time, Zelda was something completely new and exciting. It was more than enough stimulants for kids to play the game for hours and hours on end, exploring every nook and cranny to find every secret no matter how cryptic. Not to mention, in a way, it was also a collaborative effort. I read about how kids playing Zelda would exchange info and notes during school, using all they would learn collectively to conquer the quest of saving Zelda. That kind of experience, that kind of magic, ain't really achievable anymore, at least for this game. Zelda 1 is a masterclass in capturing imagination. For as elusive the game itself is, the manual is more than open to thoroughly detail every aspect in the game. A complete documentation of every item and every enemy. I can only imagine that for the time, this was more than enough world building to get kids to play the crap out of this game without ever getting bored. A noble pursuit to rescue Zelda from the clutches of Ganon and to save the land of Hyrule. It's a big part as to why this game has become as influential as it is, but like I said, reliving that original experience isn't possible, or at least sensible. With decades of evolved games and media long past this original title, I wouldn't recommend any newcomer playing this game without some kind of outside assistance. For those who feel that the idea that playing any game with a guide or walkthrough is sacrilege, understand that even the original Zelda manual included quick guides and a small map to get new players started. Copies released later even included a near-complete map with hint markers, along with all sorts of advice, tips, what every item in the dungeons are, full maps of the first 2 dungeons, and instructions on how to make your own map. Surely, I would believe a modern gamer could totally get through the game with this manual alone if they were tenacious enough. But I don't think it's realistic to expect a modern gamer to have that kind of investment or patience. Even for hardcore purists, I have to question where the line is drawn, because the same year Zelda released in North America came the official Nintendo Player's Guide. The first game covered is Zelda, with a complete map of the game and complete maps of the first 6 dungeons. A year later, Nintendo Power would hit the scene, and the very first issue is an elaborate guide of the second quest with a complete map of every secret marked. A few years later came the NES Game Atlas, official guides of the most popular NES games. Sure enough, Zelda is here, and oh gracious, a fully detailed map and complete maps of all the dungeons for the first and second quest. These are official publications by Nintendo, and I didn't even mention the miscellaneous hints that were spruced throughout other magazine issues, or the Nintendo tip line where you can call to receive answers for various secrets. I'd believe that plenty of kids playing back in the day resorted to these published guides to get through many games, including Zelda. If you still find this to be an inauthentic way to experience the game, then I encourage you to accept that guides and walkthroughs have been around for ages, and counterintuitively to what you may think, their existence isn't to null the play experience. It's to enhance it and allow new players, or stuck players, to enjoy a game as much as possible. So with that said, I want to enjoy Zelda 1 as much as possible, even if it requires a little modern adaptation. For this video, I've experimented with 3 ways to play the original Legend of Zelda, as today there's been efforts to try to improve the experience for newer players like me who never had the chance to enjoy the game like it was when it launched. The first playthrough was done via the original cartridge on an original console on a CRT. Can't really get any more authentic than that. I did have the Zelda Dungeon Guide on standby on my phone as I played. I opt to simply look at the maps and avoid actually reading the guide, as that gets tedious after a while and I don't find it that necessary. For the dungeons, they are much more straightforward, so I would simply play through them blind until I got hopelessly stuck. Even though there are still bombable walls that have no visual clue, it ain't so bad to simply bomb every wall you come across, especially when using the map found in dungeons to deduce where a bombable wall may be. The game is usually pretty good at dropping lots of extra bombs for you, so running out isn't much of an issue. It only ever became a problem in moments that I would never have thought to bomb the wall because the map doesn't list the room, but those are few and far between. For the most part, it was a rather comfortable adventure. It's amazing how many pickups can be grabbed right before the first dungeon, which frankly is the most tedious part of the game in my opinion. The dungeons are the highlight, and getting to the next one is the most exciting part of the game for me. I can imagine that lots of Zelda purists are seething at the idea of a player following a guided map like this to play the game. Is it authentic to how it was played originally? Most assuredly not, but again, I think in order to enjoy some of these older cryptic NES games, I do feel a little modern adaptation is recommendable. It may not be the same experience, but that doesn't mean it still can't be fun. I mean, come on, isn't the idea of following a treasure map on an adventure fun in of itself? It's been said again and again on how secretive some of the Overworld stuff can be. Now surprisingly, I think all required and unique collectibles are quite discoverable on their own with just a little player intuition. But all the real cryptic ones, you know, the inconspicuous wall you can bomb or bush you can burn, only have extra shops, heart containers, or rupee stashes. Certainly helpful, but ultimately optional. It's a cryptic part of the game that I'm more than fine with not worrying about. All it does for me is remove one less stressful aspect and allows me to get more comfortable with the other parts of the game. After playing for a while, I really started getting used to the stiff 4-directional controls and limited sword combat. I realized how integral to the experience they are. It's surprising how capable you really are in the game with just the sword and careful positioning. Most enemies are locked to the same 4 directions, and the sword has a surprisingly forgiving hitbox, so all it takes is anticipating enemy movement and combat becomes quite manageable. The secret sauce for me was actually using the items you acquire outside the sword. Bombs, especially for combat, I found advantageous. The boomerang is great for the enemies that do get stunned. The magic rod may be weak, but it's nice to have some kind of projectile weapon. Even the candle is pretty good at shaving health once you get the upgraded form to spam the shit out of it. I never used arrows in this playthrough simply because I didn't like the idea of wasting rupees and I didn't care to use it. Though thanks to the guide, I never had any problem being low on rupees for all the expensive, required items you need to get through the game. I could have just as easily cheesed the money-making game by saving and resetting if I lost to rack up rupees, but that sounds monotonous as fuck. I don't think it hurts the playing experience to simply know which bushes have rupee stashes. By the end of the game, I felt a comparable amount of satisfaction with the playthrough. The only practical difference between this one and my first one was not using save states. Having the real punishment that comes from no save states was great in forcing me to really engage with the gameplay. Makes the player approach obstacles more carefully and to be more mindful over enemy patterns, item usage, and planning routes through dungeons and the overworld. This was a playthrough that I'm more than confident in calling a legit run-through of Zelda 1, and my opinion of the game improved since my first one. Zelda 1 with a guide, and even then, minimal use of a guide, is a fun enough experience for me to recommend to most gamers, and especially Zelda fans. It would be hard for me now to call aspects of this game outdated, as it's still just as playable as it has been, with only a little extra assistance. With that said, there have still been efforts to modernize the classic Zelda 1 experience to make it more approachable for potential new players, and even old players who have long forgotten everything about this game. The one that's the most popular is the Zelda Redux patch for the NES ROM. This patch has a smorgasbord of changes, updates, and improvements. It would take a while to detail them all, and nearly all of them are optional, so you can essentially craft and build your ideal version of Zelda. While options are nice, I'm only going to be looking at this patch with its base install and no other additional content on offer. As much as I'd like to cover the other options, I just want to get to the game as soon as possible, and I bet the normal patch install is more than enough. The title screen includes a new subtitle tributing the Japanese title of the game. The opening scroll is rewritten with an easier to understand translation. This applies to all the dialogue text in the game, now having new translation, but all the info is essentially the same. The text itself scrolls faster, and recharging health is a lot faster now, which is great. The HUD has been reworked, with hearts now having a quarter value to be more consistent with newer Zelda games. The map is now an actual map of the overworld that fills in as you explore, which makes it so much easier to know where you've been. The amount of detail is still quite limited, but as a way to track where you are, it's pretty great. As an aside, I am playing via an emulator. This patch is perfectly playable on a flash card, but last I tried, the overworld map would glitch out a bit and become distorted, so keep that in mind. The sword now swings in an arc, similar to A Link to the Past and every other 2D Zelda game. This basically allows you to attack from two directions rather than just one. This feels amazing, but surprisingly the combat still remains challenging, as the swing is ultimately slower than the stab and doesn't seem to have as much knockback, so I found combat to remain quite difficult. The biggest and most impactful change is bumpable walls and burnable bushes now having visual signs, making them much easier to spot. I reckon this one update makes this game a hell of a lot more approachable for newer players, especially when all it does is allow the optional overworld crap to be more easily discoverable, and dungeon exploration to be less bullshit. I wouldn't even say it makes the experience less challenging, as you still risk running into door repairs, which costs rupees, and dungeons you may miss critical paths more easily or run into trap rooms, so player discretion is still advised. Speaking of rupees, the cap is now 999 instead of 255. Frankly, the cap from the original was stupid to begin with, so thumbs up from me. The max bomb count has also been slightly increased, which again, all good in my book. You can now scroll through items with the select button without bringing up the pause screen, which is cool. It only goes in one direction, and trying to swap items in the heat of combat adds some nice adrenaline to encounters. Many sprites across the board have been updated, like the overworld sprites now having a more natural pattern to them, and enemy sprites contain more detail. It's a matter of taste, and I think I actually like the more simplistic look of the original sprites. I'm extremely picky when it comes to visual tweaks like these, but the ones here are really good and only adds to the imagination of visualizing these classic Zelda characters. The water throughout the game and the waterfall now having animation is a great touch. The arrow was reworked to be a proper independent item. You can still buy arrows from shops, but now they drop as their own item, and all you need now is the bow to use it. This made me more comfortable to use arrows, and arrows are actually a great weapon that deal lots of damage in the early game. I can't help but feel this change actually makes the game harder, as now heart drops and fairy drops are less likely, as the RNG item drops now have to share with the new arrows. Either way, I do like this change and find it to be an improvement to the original mechanics. Several items were changed, like instead of rings you get new tunics, which lines closer to newer games and contextualizes Link's color swaps more. The dungeon map system is more modern, with the map now gradually being filled in as you explore, which again lines closer to newer games and makes it easier to navigate, which overall is great, as many rooms look alike, so it's easy to get lost. Even after collecting the map, you can still reference the pause map to find rooms you have not explored yet. Some of the dungeons have new music arrangements that include a remix of A Link to the Past's dungeon music, which is a nice touch. A new mechanic is the flute now killing Pul's voice, which maintains its manual hint and keeps the original Famicom mechanic without the need of the player 2 controller mic. There's probably even more changes I can mention, but those are the ones that I've noticed. It may all seem pretty daunting, but trust me, it never got distracting. I opt to not read into the changes much and just start up the game to discover them naturally. As abundant as these changes are, it ultimately doesn't change the actual game very much. Zelda 1 boils down to exploring to find dungeons and making your way through said dungeons. That experience is still very much intact with this patch, only now it's one that doesn't require Nintendo power to beat it. For real, this playthrough I was able to do without any outside assistance. Most of the time. I'll be transparent and admit I did abuse emulator save states to avoid paying door repairs should I run into them, and cheesing the money making game cause fuck you, I can. I also still used a map for Death Mountain cause I don't got all day. In conclusion, I was having quite a bit of fun with this patched version. In fact, it was notably more fun than playing the original. As much as I'll defend using a guide when playing Zelda 1, there's no escaping the fact that you're still taking your eyes off the game. With the updates provided in this patch, it allows the player to approach the challenge of this game with their own wits, without feeling like the game is being cheap. Even for Zelda 1 purists, I like to imagine this patched version is the ideal modern way to experience Zelda 1. I'd certainly say so. There's still loads of other changes you can make, but I'd advise just installing base Redux and playing it that way. This is a version of Zelda 1 that maintains what made the original so great, while also tossing aside and ironing out the aspects that make people hate this game nowadays. I had a great time with this one. Check it out. Finally, the latest Zelda 1 re-release I'll talk about is Infidelity's Super Nintendo port. I talked about how much I enjoyed his Metroid port and was excited to check this one out. The main idea behind this one is simply recompiling the code to have the game playable on Super Nintendo, while keeping the game mostly one-to-one with quality of life updates kept at a bare minimum. The idea behind this playthrough was seeing how much of the game I could get through from memory alone, as after playing the game twice at this point, I had a pretty good idea of where things were and where to go. There's only a handful of quality of life changes. Thanks to being on Super Nintendo, this ROM includes MSU1 support for enhanced CD quality audio. Playing with this updates all the music and includes new music for shops and other sub-areas. While neat, there is a disconnect of arrangements that gets distracting because of all the sources that are used. The Overworld theme now uses the Zelda cartoon version, which is cool, but because that track is missing the second half of the song, it gets extremely repetitive. I'd advise just using the original NES sound font. It would have been cool to have the updated Famicom music, but that's a pointless nitpick. There's a new transition animation similar to A Link to the Past, which looks pretty cool. Health recharge is instant now, awesome. You can swap items in real time, which works better here since you have the two shoulder buttons as opposed to just one button. Finally, the extra processing power of the Super Nintendo removes all sprite flickering and slowdown, which is pretty great, not gonna lie, and makes the experience overall feel much smoother. Other than those changes, this is the original Zelda 1 experience, just as it was on NES. Some may be disappointed with the lack of further changes, and to that I say, if that's what you want, then play Redux. Otherwise, you can make your own decompiled Super Nintendo port. The creative idea behind this release is to be Zelda 1 on Super Nintendo, nothing more. With the extra processing on Super Nintendo, I'm sure someone will create unique patches for this release which can potentially do more than the Redux patch on NES, so we'll see. I didn't want to redo my playthrough of vanilla Zelda 1 on NES, so I used this opportunity to see if my memory alone could get me through the game. For the most part, it did. Navigation in the overworld did become a challenge because I was spoiled by the Redux patch, but since I was more familiar with the map as a whole, I could get around okay enough with the gray map to reference my general location. I remembered all the heart container spots as they were usually the most memorable once you knew them, and a good number of the rupee stashes. In case I still needed some rupees, I still save scummed the money making game because fuck you. There was some satisfaction with getting through this mostly vanilla Zelda experience from memory alone. As much as many would hate the use of guides, the ultimate endpoint is a player no longer needing it, and once that happens, the game only becomes more enjoyable. Really, I don't have any further notes to add. I did miss some of the changes from Redux, mostly smaller, inconsequential stuff like increased bomb sizes and dungeon maps being filled in as you played. Some of these later dungeons can be quite the test of patience, and I'll still admit, I needed a map for Death Mountain because, fuck you, I ain't putting up with that. If you're an audience who feels the Redux patch takes away what the original experience is supposed to invoke, then perhaps this Super Nintendo port may be the version for you. I'll say it easily tops over the NES original without having to contend with the changes some may argue are unnecessary. If you don't want to be spoiled by the Redux changes, then play this version. As similar to the original as it is, it still makes the NES version obsolete. For what it's worth, no slowdowns went a long way for me, and I wish Redux still didn't suffer from it. With that said, I will have to admit, I still had more fun with Redux. This Super Nintendo port is fantastic, and if I were to ever truly test my skill and intuition with Zelda 1, then I'll play this version. However, since I'm not usually looking for ball-busting challenge in games, then honestly the Redux patch will probably stand as the version of Zelda I'll go back to. That concludes my back-to-back marathon of playing the original Legend of Zelda, and to tell you the truth, I like this game a lot more now. It's weird how even though I couldn't care less for this game before, playing it again and again slowly made me come around to really enjoy what this game truly offers. I think I can see more easily now why lots of Zelda fans yearned for the series to return to this original, more non-linear approach to the formula. While I find this game to still be more linear than you'd think, what this game does do is not hold your hand. The most fun part for me among all these playthroughs is finding out where the next dungeon was. That kind of intuitive exploring was addicting, and there's an incredible satisfaction to finally locating the next labyrinth. That's ultimately the appeal I find with the original Zelda. It's a self-contained puzzle box that's so much fun to unravel and solve. I can imagine the feelings I had were only a fraction of what kids playing this game for the first time felt. Even though there has been written guides for this game during its release cycle, there was still a time where young players were tackling this game completely blind. Any new discovery, no matter how small, was a grand achievement. It's an adventure in its purest form, and for that, I hold this game with lots of respect and still find it to be a good time today. Maybe there will come a time where I decide to finally test the playability of this game by going in as raw as possible, drawing my own maps, writing down notes, and thoroughly testing my wits to uncover all the secrets on offer. But that'll have to wait until I'm at a point where I don't remember all the puzzles in this game anymore. I know some of you are probably wanting me to cover that Zelda Remastered patch that's available on the Miizen emulator. While it looks cool, I'm honestly not too interested at the moment. It seems to have all the quality of life updates that the Redux patch has, but with overhauled sprite visuals, which again looks cool. However, since the foundation is still that of an early NES game, then I feel the new visuals kind of make the rest of the game, like animation and enemy patterns and all that, to look more janky as a result. I simply prefer using my imagination from the ambiguity of the older, simple sprites, but it's ultimately a matter of taste. I'm sure Zelda Remastered is a damn fine way to play through the first game for new players, or as a comparable alternative to BS Zelda. Either way, I've fully come around to this game and no longer see it as just a curiosity for Zelda fans only. There's still merit to playing this game today that I'd recommend every gamer try because the satisfaction of exploring the land of Hyrule is still as strong as ever. To be completely truthful, I'm envious of those who played this game for the first time way back when The Legend of Zelda was just that, a legend, an aspiring quest to save a land. Before we knew what every part of that legend entailed, before the history behind it was documented, before even knowing what Ganon looked like, because the only way to find out was to survive long enough to tell the tale. That's the kind of shit that grabs the imagination. Those little youngsters playing this game at launch, figuring out all its secrets, trading advice and hints in the playground, drawing maps, theorizing solutions, we're experiencing an adventure that modern gamers can only dream about. Honestly, it's at a point where I question the real purpose of remaking this game now. I can only imagine what a from-the-ground-up remake of this game may be like. With modernized graphics, 360 directional movement, retooled items in combat, and simplified puzzles and secrets. As great as that sounded before, I think what those kinds of updates would do is take away what makes this game special today. I don't think remaking this game is advisable, as I feel it's better to create new experiences based on the foundation of this game. Breath of the Wild brought the series back to the open-ended nature of this original game and already acts as a spiritual remake in a way. But even better, I think there's another game that perfectly captures the wonder and mystery of the original Zelda. A game that functions as the remake of Zelda 1 people have been clamoring for. It may not share its title, it may not share its world, but it does share its spirit, and it's a game I'd like to talk about next time. It's a game that I've put off playing for a while simply from me being intimidated by it. But like any challenge, it's better to confront it rather than avoid it. I'm not usually too interested in spiritual successors, but this game made me truly understand their purpose and makes me want to seek them out more. Unfortunately, that may take a while as I'm still busy with moving, the never-ending game I'm playing, and other responsibilities, but I'll try to have the next video out as soon as I can. I'd like to thank those who've watched up to this far as I discover the real value of the first game in my favorite franchise of all time. I love the original Legend of Zelda, and I think it's now up there as one of my favorite NES games, which I never thought I'd say. I hope I got some of you interested in giving this game a real chance, as anything is possible and any game is worth trying, even if you don't like it initially. I don't think I have anything else to discuss today, so all that's left for me to say is thank you for watching.